You might not know that we are in a little mini-series on the book of Daniel, looking at the life of Daniel in the Old Testament. And James was speaking last week on how we can thrive in the middle of a culture that doesn't worship God. How we can follow Jesus in an environment which feels like in many ways it's traveling in the opposite direction. And if you missed that talk, then you can go and find it on the live stream. But this week, we're going to look at another aspect of Daniel's life, another thing, the way that he lived that still speaks to us even today. And I don't know if you've read the book of Daniel at all. I read it recently to refresh myself with the story. And when I read it, I thought two things. Firstly, some of it is pretty wacky. I mean, if you don't believe me, go and read the second half. But another thing I thought was, wow, I really need to get a life, because Daniel really, really lives. I mean, his life was a roller coaster from start to finish. So, on the one hand, just anything he did for work, he just got promoted. His life is like a manual on how to get a promotion in your office. He served under 4 separate kings, that he attained high political office, that would make number 10 look incredibly boring. But on the other hand, the threat of persecution was literally around every corner. So he was told to eat the Babylonian food or he'd get into trouble. He's told to interpret dreams for the king. And if the king didn't like the interpretations, then he'd get into even more trouble. He's told to worship other gods. And if he doesn't, then he'll get into trouble. And amidst this chaotic adventure of a life that's lived so well for God, one thing is made so clear in this book, one thing in his life that we can be absolutely sure of, and that is that he knew how to pray. So we're going to spend a bit of time looking at the way that Daniel prayed. And I don't know about you, but when somebody starts by saying they're going to talk about prayer, I know that emotions of kind of inadequacy start to bubble up in me. So if that's the case for you, then be encouraged, because really my hope is that we'll, with the time that we have, just be encouraged by who God is. Be encouraged by his character and his nature, and that would compel us into his presence. And we're going to spend a bit of time looking at chapter 6, which gives us insight into Daniel's prayer life. And in this chapter, we find probably the most famous story of Daniel's life, his big success story, and that is being thrown into the lion's den and surviving it. And I don't know how you imagine this scene in the Bible. You might not imagine Daniel as an elderly man, but actually by this point in his life, he was probably about 80 years old. And so as we approach this scripture, we're not meeting just this young, enthusiastic believer that's going to tone it down later on in life. We're actually meeting an elderly man that has just done what he has always done, and that is to call on the name of the Lord in the good times, but also in the bad times. And so we're going to pick up the story in Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 to 10, and it's the build up to the lion's den. So it says this: it pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, we'll never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, may King Darius live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius put the decree in writing. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. So that's the passage of Scripture. And what does it tell us about prayer? What can we learn from Daniel's life in how we can pray today? Well, as a starting place, we can probably be sure that prayer for Daniel was plan A. And when I say plan A, I don't mean that if it didn't work, he was going to go to plan B and plan C. I more mean that for Daniel, prayer was just instinctive. It was like his first response. And so just to reiterate the story, so Daniel, he's got a promotion in classic Daniel style, and he's appointed as chief administrator above the other 2 and above the 120 satraps, which is a great name for a politician, a satrap. And that got a surprising laugh. And in other words, corruption was rife because there was all of these people that couldn't be trusted, and he was appointed so that the king might not suffer loss. Okay, and so that's why he was appointed. And so this secret plan unfolds because they're essentially jealous of him. And they devise this plan that they'll go to the king and get him to issue an edict or a law to say that if anyone prays to any other god or human being, would be thrown into the lion's den. And as soon as Daniel hears about this, as soon as news reaches his ear, what does he do? He goes and prays in his bedroom. That's his first and instinctive response. In other words, prayer was for Daniel plan A. He didn't have to be reminded to pray. He didn't have to be kind of forced to. It was just this instinctive lifestyle thing. It was just the overflow of his heart that he chose to get down on his knees and pray. I had a friend growing up who I went to church with, and she was a good friend. And whenever I offloaded something to her, something that I was struggling with, she'd often respond by saying, "Can I pray for you?" Which I know is a really, really lovely thing to do. But I remember feeling at the time just really annoyed by it, because I kind of thought, I don't want your prayers. I just want to engage my brain and find a solution to the problem. And I was kind of reflecting on it this week, and I thought, what would my life look like, or what would our lives look like if prayer was just this instinctive thing, this response, this kind of language of our lives, this lifestyle that we choose to inhabit? And I'm not saying that we trade in our reason or our ability to problem solve. You know, God gave us brains for a reason, but what would it look like to just make prayer a given? It was just a given. It's just what we do. And what's even more significant is not that really he made prayer plan A. It was something underneath that was deeper and more profound. And that is that Daniel, he must have just had this unwavering trust in the faithfulness of God. Because what you find with people who have learned to pray like this is just this confidence that God will answer their prayers, that God really listens. And prayer can become plan A, I guess, for a few reasons. I mean, perhaps in a moment of crisis, you know, Watford are 2-0 down, your car breaks down on the motorway, whatever your definition of a crisis is. But another reason could be that you just have this well of conviction that God listens, that he can actually do something. And in Daniel, we have this example of somebody that chose to do that he made prayer his plan A. And what's interesting is that Jesus, he's got loads to say on this as well. So in Matthew chapter 18, there's this time when somebody goes to Jesus and he says, "Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And what Jesus does next is really interesting. So he calls a little child to him And he puts the child in the middle of this crowd of people and he points basically and says, unless you change and become like a little child, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. That kind of stings a bit. I mean, I don't know if you've spent any time with small children really recently. They're really sweet, but they can't do anything for themselves particularly. You know, they just constantly rely on other people. And Jesus is saying, if you want to be great in the kingdom, if you want to grow in your discipleship, in your walk with me, become like a child. You know, to grow up spiritually is almost to grow down, to become like a child and depend on God in all things, in the big things and the small things, where you're lacking and where you feel you have plenty. So prayer was plan A for Daniel, but what else can we learn from this story? What else speaks to us on how we can pray today? Well, another thing that we can see is that Daniel prayed with thankfulness. And thankfulness probably wasn't something to twist God's arm. It wasn't step 2 in answered prayer or anything like that. It would have just been the overflow of his heart. And he did it even when he had reason not to. So if we turn back to the story that we read at the beginning. So Daniel, he's heard the bad news. Worship of the living God is outlawed. You can't do it. And as soon as he does it, he starts to pray. It says he got down on his knees, giving thanks to his God. In verse 10, giving thanks. And it's important to remember that in this story, it wasn't just a bad day. It wasn't just a bad day at the office. Like, he was genuinely fearing for his life. It was the threat of persecution, but he chose to give thanks, not for the situation, but definitely in the situation, that he chose to be thankful. And we could read that and, ask the question, why? Why did Daniel choose to give thanks in a moment like that? Like, why? That seems crazy. Why would you choose to do that? And I guess on one level, we're not going to know, are we? We can't exactly ask him, at least not yet. But what we could assume is that for Daniel, thankfulness was a habit. He just did it. It says 3 times a day he got down on his knees, prayed, and gave thanks. He was an elderly man by this point, so that's giving thanks a lot. There's a lot of thankfulness that would have come in his life. And so it probably would have been more difficult for Daniel not to give thanks than to do it. It was just his habit. It was his rhythm. And that's a miracle in and of itself. We've got a man here who is walking the corridors of earthly power and glory. He's rubbing shoulders with the great, the good, the wealthy. But 3 times a day, he gets down on his knees, he prays, and he gives thanks. So it was his habit, but maybe we could also assume that he just believed God was worthy. He believed that God was worthy of his thankfulness, that God was never not worthy, whatever situation he found himself in, that he just had this resolve that he would choose to give thanks. And what's striking about thankfulness in the Bible is it bubbles up in the most unlikely or unusual places. So you've got Daniel, but also Jonah in the Old Testament, who's stuck in the belly of a whale. He's trapped and he's all alone. And it says that with shouts of grateful praise, in the belly of the whale, he gave shouts of grateful praise, not just when he was spat out, but when he was in the whale. Or you've got Paul in the New Testament, who's found himself in prison, which was quite a common occurrence. And he's in this prison cell and he starts writing to some of his other friends or Christians. And he says, rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. That he chose to give thanks in the prison and not just when he was sent out of it. Or take Jesus on the night that he was betrayed, when his friends were about to desert him, when Peter would go on and deny him 3 times, Judas would stab him in the back, and he'd go to the cross and be killed. And it says that while they were eating, Jesus took bread and giving thanks, broke it and gave it to them. That Jesus gave thanks before the cross and not just after it. There was this wealthy American lawyer called Horatio Spafford in the 19th century. And he was a Christian man, but he suffered a great deal in life. So he lost his one and only son to scarlet fever. And then a year later or so, he lost a load of his real estate assets in a fire. And then some years later again, the economy took a dive and he lost even more money and he was basically financially ruined. And so he decided with his family to go on a mission trip, because what would you do if you got bankrupt? You'd go on a mission to England. And so he sent his wife and his 4 daughters on a boat across the Atlantic to go to England. And as the boat was crossing, the boat tragically sank and his 4 daughters passed away and only his wife survived. And when Anna, his wife, got to England, she sent a telegram that said, "Saved alone," to let him know that his 4 daughters had died. And so when Horatio Spafford heard of the news, he got on a boat himself and he went to go and join his grieving wife. And as the boat was passing roughly where the ship went down and where his daughters would have passed away, what he did was amazing. He got out a pen and some paper, and he just started writing a song. And I won't sing it, but it goes like this: "When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul." Like, what an amazing thing to say in those circumstances. And you might know the hymn, "It is well with my soul." What an offering of thanks in the most unlikely of places. Somebody said, "We will be praising God for all eternity, but a sacrifice of praise is something we will only have the chance to give him here on earth." That the bizarre privilege of giving thanks through trial, it's only something we'll do this side of heaven, but we have this choice to give thanks, and not for everything that goes on in life, but in it. And in this story, we've got a guy, Daniel, who chose to do that. He had a resolve to give thanks in all situations. And then to look at something else. So Daniel made prayer his plan A. He chose to give thanks, but what else did he do? And what is absolutely clear, if you read the book of Daniel, what's clear in the story, but on every kind of page, chapter of this book, is that Daniel knew that God was on the throne. He really knew that God was in charge, that God was both powerful and loving, that he was in control of events and also in control of the future. And that's obvious in the passage we've just read, isn't it? Because you wouldn't get down on your knees and start praying if you didn't fundamentally believe that God could actually do something, that he could actually answer your prayers. You just wouldn't do it. But it's also clear throughout the whole book. So in chapter 7, which kind of begins the bit more wacky stuff, okay? And he has this dream which he writes down. And in this dream, there are 4 beasts which stand for the earthly kingdoms that rise up and are wreaking havoc. And then what happens is the scene flips and Daniel starts to dream about God. And it says this in verse 9, "As I looked, thrones were set in place and the Ancient of Days took his seat." And the Ancient of Days was God. So when Daniel dreamed about God, when he thought about God, when he had a vision of God, God was sat down and he was on a throne. That was Daniel's conviction. And then it gets even better in the dream, because what happens is this figure, the Son of Man, comes along, which might sound familiar because it's fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And the Son of Man is exalted by the Ancient of Days. And it goes on that he writes this in verse 14. "He was given authority, glory and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will never pass away. His kingdom is one that will never be destroyed." And it would be easy to think when we read these parts of the Bible, maybe Daniel's head was just lost in the clouds. Maybe he'd had, a load of cheese before he went to bed and his dreams were a bit crazy. But it's really important because it tells us that Daniel knew his God. He really knew what God was like, that for a moment in the dream, he was seeing life how God sees it every day. That God's on the throne and Jesus is at the right hand. And I wonder if sometimes we can I know this is definitely true for me, we can feed ourselves a bit of a diet that God is a friend and he draws close. And that is, by the way, absolutely true. All over the Bible, but even in chapter 3 of Daniel, that there's Daniel's mates and they're thrown into the fiery furnace and God comes and meets them right in the middle of where they're at and he delivers them. God does come close. But the wonderful news about a God that draws close is that it's the same God who's on the throne. The one that draws close is also on the throne. That the one that we can know as friend is also matchless in power. Every knee will bow, every tongue will confess. It's the same God. And Daniel knew this. He clearly knew it, and it made a difference to the way that he prayed. I was at a church quite a long time ago, and there was this time of worship. And we were all worshiping, and there was this guy there who was worshiping really enthusiastically, like with such passion. And I know that's not that unusual to say in a church like our own, but it was kind of like an enthusiasm I had never quite experienced before. And he was just going for it. And I remember thinking, wow, he is really keen. He's going for it. And then we were in this prayer meeting a bit later on. And we were all together praying, and he got us to hold hands and start singing that song, I've got the joy, 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 joy down in my heart. I don't know if you know it. And I just remember thinking, what is going on? And then I heard his story a little bit later. And what you can pick up from my stories is I'm actually a bit more judgmental than I realized. But if you heard his story later on, it was a guy, he's called Tony. And he had a really difficult life for many, many years. And he was abusing drugs. He was suffering from loads of anxiety. He lost so much in life. And he didn't know the Lord. And he had some Christian neighbors who lived next door to him. And what these neighbors used to do is they would lay their hands on the adjoining walls and they would pray for Tony to become a Christian. And amazingly, he became a Christian. He got saved. He got delivered of so much. And I was even speaking this week, and his life is completely turned around. And, he was saying that because God has saved him from so much, that's why he prays and worships the way that he does. And when I heard that, I thought that makes a lot of sense. That explains it. And we don't have to worship and pray like Tony, and our lives might be very, very different to his, but it does kind of make you wonder, has a revelation of God changed the way that you pray? Has an encounter with his glory, with his power to save, with the fact that he's on the throne, has it changed the way that you pray? And I know for me, I would start praying more. Probably I just would full stop, I'd pray more. I'd probably pray with more joy, like Tony did if I knew God was on the throne. I'd probably pray more boldly if I knew. I probably would pray with more conviction if I really knew that God was on the throne. And with Daniel, we've got somebody just like that. He knew what God was like. He knew that God was on the only throne that counts for anything. That he was on the throne, that God was in charge, that he really was in control. And so a good question we could ask ourselves is, where do we need to know that God is on the throne? Where do we need to know that? Because we don't have to look too far to think he's probably fallen off. In our world right now, there are wars and rumors of wars. You know, we've prayed about it already in the service. This isn't just something that Daniel was living in. Like, there are people right now that know the wreaking havoc of nations that are against war, but we can pray with genuine conviction that God is on the throne. What's the point if we don't? You know, we can pray that he does rule over the nations. He actually will judge the living and the dead, that we can pray like that. Or perhaps in this church, which, you know, it's been another difficult week in lots of ways in the life of this church, but we can pray with conviction that God is on the throne, that he doesn't abandon his people, that he leads his people. He leads them on, that we can pray that and know that. Or even in our personal lives, and you'll know what that is, you know, but we can know that he's in charge, that we can have an experience, a knowledge of the Ancient of Days that's taken his seat, that he rules with an everlasting kingdom, that's just not this kind of abstract thing. It's right here, and there'll be a day, you know, that we can have real hope in real lives here and now, that we can know that. And so just to finish, I don't want to presume to know what's going on for your life or with your family life or where you live. And I certainly don't want to presume to know how you feel you can't or cannot pray right now. That is up to you. But I am struck by Daniel as somebody that really made prayer his plan A, that he had this first instinctive response, and he probably wasn't born like that, you know. This was when he was about 80 years old. It had become this habit, this thing that he did. But also he prayed with thankfulness, that he gave thanks in the craziest of situations. And nowhere in the Bible does it say that life's going to be easy. Like, nowhere. But he had great success, but he also had real trials and challenges. But he gave thanks in situations just like that. It was his habit, and I'm sure he just believed that God was worthy of his thankfulness. And we also have somebody who knew that God was on the throne, and that is the gist of this book of Daniel. It's that nations will rise, but God is on his throne, that God is in control, and he must have known that to pray in the way that he did, that God is in control, that God sits on the only throne that counts for anything. He's in control, he's in charge.